This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse murder and their families. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 176, Dead Dog Road. In 2003, an East Texas couple adopted 3 young Russian children. Over the years, there were countless red flags for child abuse, especially against the oldest child, Alexey, who began running away when he was 12. He ended up on the doorstep of the Roosevelt House, an emergency shelter, assessment center, and residential care facility for children removed from abusive situations, usually by CPS. The home's founder, Diane Black, had no idea that her battle to save Alexey and his sisters, Anastasia and Svetlana, would upend life as she knew it. Diane detailed the story of Alexey, his sisters, the Roosevelt House, and the egregious systemic failure of the Texas child protection system in a book called Dead Dog Road, a true story into the dark world of an abused child. In this episode, you'll hear my recent conversation with Diane about the appalling ways CPS and law enforcement failed Alexey, Anastasia, and Svetlana, and much more. This is episode 176, Dead Dog Road. I recently had the privilege of reading Dead Dog Road, one of the most gripping books I've ever read. I'll read you the description of the book from Diane's website. In a small Texas town, the director of a children's home tries to save 3 adopted Russian children living with a sadistic woman in the backwoods of Caney Head. A heart-stopping story that highlights the failure of the agencies we trust to protect the most vulnerable among us, and a truth more compelling and powerful than we could imagine. Abuse reports from neighbors draw attention to 12-year-old Alexey, who runs away to hide in the woods. The local child protection agency sends the director of the children's home to visit Alexey and his younger sisters, Anastasia and Svetlana. But despite her compelling report, the agency believes the denials of the adoptive mother and leaves the children in the abusive home. Knowing the horrible truth, the director faces one obstacle after another as she tries to find someone to protect the children from the unspeakable. Dead Dog Road, a place where secrets are buried, like the injured fighting dogs who are dumped there. The book gets its name from a road near the children's adoptive home that is known as Dead Dog Road, but there's no graphic description of animal abuse, in case that's a potential trigger. Child abuse is detailed extensively in the book, however, but my regular listeners are quite accustomed to hearing that. For obvious reasons, this story is right up my alley. Once I started reading Dead Dog Road, I couldn't put it down, and I implore every listener to go out and read this book as soon as possible. If you listen to this podcast, I'm telling you, you must read this book. I have no doubt it will enthrall you, infuriate you, and stick with you the same way it has me. I'll include links in the show notes to Diane's website and the book's listings on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I recently had the privilege of talking to Diane about the book, the children in the story, and much more. Please enjoy my conversation with the author of Dead Dog Road, Diane Black. Today I'm talking with Diane Black, the author of Dead Dog Road. Hi, Diane. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I very much appreciate you reaching out because, as I was telling you before, I think this is a very important book, and it really goes along with what I'm trying to do with this podcast, too.
Well, I'm really excited about getting this story out there because, like you said, it really is an important story.
It definitely is. Would you mind giving us your background and how you got to where you are?
I'm a professional counselor in North Dallas, and I had a contract with Child Protective Services, and I saw hundreds of children who had been removed from their homes for one reason or another, all horrible reasons, actually. And so I was sent to residential treatment facilities, which are homes for abused children, and they were not the best. And I didn't like it that children were being put in facilities that sort of had the atmosphere like a nursing home. They didn't feel like a home. And some of them were actually deplorable. So I had a dream of creating a home that felt like a home and where the kids were treated like kids who live in a normal home.
So one of the things that I wrote down first when I was reading the book was the phrase deliberate indifference. And that feels so accurate to me.
Yes.
I've covered so many CPS failures. Probably 75% of the cases I cover involve CPS not stepping in when they should have. It's just so sad how often it happens, and it's all over the country. And in fact, it's all over the world. I'm wondering about the Russian kids. Why do you think that the Deckerts adopted them to begin with?
That's $1 million question. They lived in the backwoods of a place called Caney Head, outside of a small Texas town. And it was always really clear that they couldn't afford to adopt 3 Russian children. I was told that they got the 3 kids for $5,000. I don't have any proof, and I didn't put anything in the book that I don't have any proof of, but I don't mind saying this. It was shady somehow, but I don't know how or why. All I know is when I stepped into the situation, they had the children, and they lived in the woods.
There was a picture in one of the Russian articles from 2013. It's pretty ramshackle looking.
It is, and all the windows were covered with plywood.
Right, and that's a huge sign right there.
Absolutely. Something very wrong in that house.
And that's what kind of gets me is once apparently the sheriff's office told them they had to take the plywood off the window, but I don't understand why they were so willing to believe everything that these people said. It's so bizarre.
Somehow, Child Protective Services believed the adoptive mother. And I've heard this from the children. She was really good at making things appear a way that they weren't. She was very deceptive. She would stage them and take pictures of them doing normal things and put the pictures around in the living room. And she would cry her heart out about how much she loved the children. And as you know, when Child Protective Services goes to a home, they give notice.
Right, which is crazy to me.
It really is. So they didn't see what an investigator saw later and what was described to me by the boy. The girls were afraid to tell the truth. They were threatened with their lives. And the boy was afraid not to tell the truth because it was so much worse for him. He was locked in a room for days at a time with only a bucket. Right. There was one window that was screwed shut and spray painted black. He was given very little food, and she beat him every day. The look in his eyes when he told me these things broke my heart. And he asked me if I knew anyone who might want to adopt him.
My heart just goes out to him. He sounds like he suffered so much. And I wish I could say I've never heard such a horrible story of abuse, but he reminds me of a bunch of the kids that I've talked about. The concept of the targeted child. It seems like when there's narcissism involved, as you kind of mentioned there may be with Penny, that seems to be a theme.
I don't just believe this. I know that she was sadistic. Like she was a true sadist. And her husband was an accomplice. And I believe he was a masochist because she abused him to some extent. And if she instructed him to abuse the children, he did. There are some things I did not include in the book because the children did not want me to. It was also very bad for the girls. And Anastasia was locked in the room a few times. Svetlana less. but they all experienced really horrific treatment. What I thought about when Alexey told me about his life, it reminded me of POW stories.
Yeah, definitely. There's torture involved.
Oh, yeah, there was. There absolutely was. No matter how good a liar the woman was, how CPS missed this is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
His teeth were broken.
Right.
And I think her story about that was that a horse kicked him in the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't make any sense. Okay, if you have a child, a horse kicks the child in the mouth, teeth are broken, and your CPS, you ask for medical records.
It would be neglect if they didn't take him to see someone, even if that was what happened.
Absolutely. That would be medical neglect. And so it seems to me that better training needs to take place and that the state governments throw money at the child protection systems. I think they really want it to work, but they put the money in the wrong places.
Definitely. If they're making reunification the priority or keeping the family intact over the safety of the child, then we're doing it all wrong.
Right. Because the agency is rewarded for leaving a child in an abusive home. And no matter how dedicated or caring a social worker is, they cannot protect a child in an abused home. It's not possible. I was pretty naive about CPS back then. And they sent me to see the children. And I did psychosocial evaluations on the 3 children and the adoptive father. And I worked all one weekend to get that taken care of because I thought they were waiting for my reports so they could see the judge and get the children out of that situation. And then when I didn't hear anything, I called and I was told by the social worker that family-based safety services were going to be provided. So then my next move was to try to find someone who would help the children. And this is kind of unbelievable. The adoptive father wanted the girls to stay in the home. He was unhappy that Alexey wasn't removed. And so he called me and asked me if I would do a private placement at the Roosevelt House for the boy, which I did. And obviously he was very happy to get out because he ran away every chance he got and stayed in the woods.
Yeah, sounds like he developed some skills.
He was very sweet, determined, and desperate child. And I think that his vulnerability made him more of a target. These people tend to target weakness. They're an easier victim. This has been hard for me too, because I've always been very trusting and tend to see the good in people and believe the best. And it's been really kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around that there are really, truly people in the world that I don't know what to say other than that they're actually evil.
Yeah, there's no redeeming qualities.
Well, there's a spectrum of everything, and I think that goes for human behavior, integrity, character. Just some people don't have a conscience. People like this derive pleasure from the pain of others and the suffering of others. One thing she used to do, all the children told me this, she would hurt them and then she would laugh.
It's so disturbing.
It really is.
I'll pause here for a quick word from my sponsors.
So there's that. And then there's the CPS situation. I had Alexey in my care at the Roosevelt House, and he was instructed by CPS, the adoptive father, that he might have to pay child support or be charged with abandonment.
And that's right after he turned him over to you.
Yes. CPS contacted him and gave him erroneous information. I don't really have an explanation for that other than they felt like they should be calling the shots, and it looked like I was overriding them. I'm really not sure what they were thinking, but I went to talk to the supervisor. I'm ashamed that when Mr. Decker called and told me what CPS said and that he needed to go and get the child from the Roosevelt House, I made a mistake. And I should have said no. I should have stood between him and that child and protected him. But at the time, I was afraid of getting in some kind of trouble. I still believe that CPS would figure it out. I thought that I could explain to them and talk to them and that they would help him. So after he went back to that abusive home, I went to the supervisor and I talked to him. He told me it was all blamed on the kids, like they had a reactive attachment disorder, which was not the case. He bought whatever story the adoptive mom told him, and he'd never met the children. He admitted that. And I said, are you aware that he runs away and hides in the woods and that he's broken into houses to steal food because he's hungry? And no one would press charges on him. Actually, the neighbors would try to help, and they'd sometimes hide him and take him in. He said, well, that's because when they were in Russia, they lived on the streets, which that wasn't true either. And I said, well, you know, if you take a child in and you feed them and care for them for 5 or 6 years, they wouldn't feel the need to have to steal food from kids' lunches at school. And teachers were calling CPS. So the solution to that was they were taken out of school. They hadn't been in school for 2.5 years.
Were they actually learning anything? I know homeschooling is used as an excuse for abuse a lot of the time, but were they actually learning, or was she just saying that?
I think early on they learned to speak English. And she put them in school. One was in kindergarten and 2 of them were in 1st grade, because I think they just kind of put them all in there together because they just learned to speak English and they didn't have a foundation. But they were very, very intelligent children. And so I don't know how much they were able to learn, but the original school they went to was in a town called Raywood in Texas. And the teachers were calling CPS, and the school nurse made a report and even took photos of Alexey because she said he was literally black and blue. So CPS was looking at them in Raywood. And so what happened, and this was told to me by some Raywood residents who were concerned, they moved out of town in the middle of the night. And they went to another county, which is also a problem because apparently if something happens in one county, the next county isn't aware of it.
Yeah, there is not a system to transfer the records or to follow up. And that is such a huge problem. I've seen that happen a lot too. And the moving in the middle of the night, it's like formulaic for these people.
Well, it worked.
Yeah.
Because they moved to an area north of Silsbee, Texas, known as Caney Head, out in the woods. They put the kids in school there. But then after enough reports went in, again, teachers, school nurse, they kept them in the home. But no, I don't think they received any education. It just was so amazing to me that I knew about these children who are being egregiously abused, and I couldn't find anyone to help them. How can that be so? This is America, of kids whose lives are in danger, and I literally could not find anyone to help them.
Yeah, because everyone's looking the other way, and CPS is just swallowing what Penny was telling them wholesale, and The police were just listening to what CPS said. It's so bizarre. They talk about a kid falling through the cracks. In this case, it's not falling through the cracks. It's like someone's ripping holes in the material so that the children fall right through. It's not a crack. It's a chasm. I don't understand it.
Yeah, well, that's a great analogy. It's a system that has become very dysfunctional, and somehow their privacy policies are working to protect the agency as opposed to the children.
Right. The agency has the most rights. The parents have the next most rights, and then the children have next to none.
Absolutely. I'm not sure how much of the actual book you want me to talk about, things that are in the book.
Well, we can kind of go through some of the major points without giving away the whole story, because I think it's worth reading all the way through no matter what. It's so well detailed, and it just puts you right in the story like you're watching it.
And you know what? No matter what I say about the story or about the book, nothing gets it across like going into the book. The book places you into the story. And so it builds, it's so much and so overwhelming that when you talk about it, it just starts to sound like a jumble.
Right. Well, you did a great job of organizing everything and putting it into an order that made sense. It was very well written, so I would never have guessed that it was your first book at all.
I felt a responsibility to write it because there are a lot of books about child abuse cases out there, a lot of great books out there, but I had never really read one that integrated the CPS issues. And there may be some, but I mean, hopefully most people know that there's a lot of child abuse and there are a lot of children who aren't being protected, a lot of children who die every year. And about half of the kids who are killed by abusers are known to CPS. And when there's an investigation into these cases, CPS conducts the investigation. So they investigate themselves. And I'm pretty sure it's the only crime investigated by civil servants. They're not trained in law enforcement. They're not trained in investigation. Not all of the social workers have social work degrees. They can be an art teacher, at least in Texas.
Yeah, they get paid so little that they're just pretty much taking in anyone who wants a job. And those are not the people who should be protecting the kids. It should be someone who actually wants to protect the kids.
If you send somebody in there who's properly trained, they understand sociopathology. They understand how good some people are at presenting things and deceiving. And one of the characteristics of a sociopathic person is charm. Think about Ted Bundy. So I know, like as mental health professionals, it's one of the things we pay attention to. Okay, think about this. If you had an adult rape victim and that person had to testify against their abuser, but they were in the home with them and had to stay in the home with them, how likely would they be to be forthcoming? They live in fear. They're in fear. They're being threatened. And so the number one thing when you have credible evidence would be to separate the child from the perpetrator. The child has to feel safe.
Yeah, not interviewing them in the house with the parent present. It's crazy.
It really is. And Alexey told the truth to law enforcement. He told the truth to a CPS worker, and it didn't do him any good. And so he stopped trying to tell them. Well, I had him in a little bit different situation. I had the adopted father and the children meet me at a church where I had a counseling office there, in addition to my regular counseling office. But anyway, so I met with them on a Saturday, and I gave him enough reassurance that he felt safe. He was also desperate.
Time for another word from my sponsors.
It's such an overwhelming problem. But I can't think of anything more important than protecting children, because they end up in our prisons. They end up living on our streets.
Yeah, continuing the cycle.
And some of them perpetuating the cycle of abuse, and they're trying to survive. Their brains are growing. They don't have the coping skills. Well, an adult doesn't have the coping skills. You can't expect a human being to navigate such an abnormal situation. Children, even more than adults, need love and nurturance and protection. To live in a constant state of fear and physical torment destroys a person's soul to a certain extent, don't you think?
Of course, yeah. And when the brain's still developing and they're being tortured throughout that period, it's going to damage them. It's going to make them develop disordered behavior and that sort of thing. So it's really no wonder with the PTSD that those 3 kids endured. It's amazing that they didn't have more problems.
Sometimes when there's a scapegoat, as you say, which is accurate, other children are forced to participate.
Basically, join in or you're going to be next.
Exactly.
I know you used some of the real names, the kids, for example, and Penny, but others you didn't.
Yeah. Every person in the book whose real name I used, I either got their permission or I didn't change their name because it was pointless, because it's public record. The 2 biological children of the Deckards, they were adults and on the sidelines, and I just didn't see any reason to put their real names out there. Now, the biological son who approached me...
Justin, I think, in the book?
Yes, and that is not his real name. Everything else is obviously true, but I was unable to locate him. But anyway, he got in touch with me years later. He was trying to find some relief for his guilt about the 3 kids and the small part that he felt like he played in it through trickery. And also because he had been in that situation and never received any help. And the one thing he said to me that I'll never forget was that, I wish I had known you when I was a child.
Yeah, because you're the one person who took this and refused to stop and pushed through everything and sacrificed so much from your own life, personal, professional. You never let go and you never stopped trying for these kids. And it's amazing. It really is.
I paid an incredible price.
Yeah, you sure did. I mean, I can only imagine. But that quote that you had in the book from Elie Wiesel, what hurt the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander. That's so powerful. I highlighted that as soon as I saw that. It's just such a powerful quote, and it really means something, you know, like maybe you're this child's last hope. And I think you were for these kids.
I think so too. I'm looking for another quote in the beginning of the book. And he said, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. I have no regrets. The only regret that I have is the time it took away from my children. And I live nearby them, and it's been very important to me to be there for them and their children. But anyway, it's not about me. It's bigger than Alexey, Anastasia, and Svetlana. It's all the children who are suffering, being abused, who are not being helped. Somehow, I don't know how it'll happen, but if enough people do what they can to help, I think things can change.
I agree. And that's why I wanted to start doing this podcast in the first place, because I really don't think as many people as you'd hope know that there's so much child abuse going on right now, or how many kids are actually dying. You don't realize that it's going on constantly, probably under your nose, and that if you don't say something, what could happen? I wish I could run out of stories to tell. I really do. I would be perfectly happy shutting down the whole podcast if I never had another child's story to tell.
There's an agency in Houston, Justice for Children.
With Randy Burton?
Yes. And he wrote me a letter about why he founded that agency. And that letter is in the book. It's a heartbreaking letter.
Each and every one of these stories, you just want to do something. You wish you could go back and intervene, but it's just so hard to hear that there's so many of them and all these names, and you see the little faces, and it's heartbreaking and tragic. What can we do? We need to do something.
So many people in the town knew what was happening, and I really struggled with the people that looked the other way. That's not true of everyone. I mean, a lot of people also tried to help, but the people who could help didn't. The people who could help looked the other way.
The ones you would expect to help.
Like Viktor Frankl says in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, there are two types of people in the world, decent people and indecent people. Mm-hmm. And the Bible, Jesus said there are two types of people. There are sheep and there are goats. And, people have different levels of empathy and compassion for others. I think telling these stories is so important because I believe in my heart that most people do care.
I'd like to think that too. Yeah, I still have faith in humanity somehow.
Right. And that wrongs can be righted and that things can change and that things can be made better. I don't know exactly how to go about that. I knew to tell the story. And in August, I'm going to Crimes Against Children conference in Dallas. They're expecting about 6,000 people. And I'm excited because I'm thinking these are 6,000 people who are on the same page that I'm on. These are 6,000 people who want to help change the system, who want to make things better for children, which makes things better for the world, makes things better for everybody. We have to at least try, right? We have to do the best we can. I'm just one person.
Right. You put in your part and just try to get the word out there. That's what I'm doing too. All you can do is contribute what you have.
Right. Exactly. And I've done that through my book, and you're doing that through your podcast. And your listeners are doing that by listening to the stories and learning and understanding the truth of the matter. So many good people do respond. And how are we told to respond? Call CPS.
Exactly.
Which we should call them every child abuse report that had ever been filed in their cases. It's in a cardboard box, and it's about 2 feet deep. I can't even pick the box up.
Wow.
It's 10 years of child abuse reports.
And multiple per year. It's not like it was just once in a while. I mean, it was a lot.
Oh, weekly. A CPS spokesperson at the end of these 10 years of reports went on TV and said, a news report, and he said, our agency exists to protect children. And that is what we have done in this case.
Certainly not all along. How much does that count when they suffered for 10 years?
Well, they didn't have any choice because the adoptive parents relinquished their rights to the children and handed them over to CPS.
Right. And didn't they say something? I saw the news articles. They were claiming they were sick of the false accusations.
Right. Yeah. They couldn't handle any more false accusations of child abuse. And that's because the Russian government became involved. But I will tell you this. I will tell you that the government officials that I dealt with, they were about the kids. They were about the children. They receive the reports. They want to make sure the children are safe.
I'll pause here for a quick word from my sponsors. I know there's going to be kids who are adopted just to be abused.
These kids, I think that is why they were adopted. Why was there a camera on the wall in the room that Alexey was locked in?
There's a number of cases where that happens. There's just something about them wanting to monitor these kids. There are, an awful lot of the time, recordings made of this abuse. They're so egregious. They're arrogant about it.
The readers of Dead Dog Road, they can sort of draw their own conclusions what they think was going on. I have theories, but I stuck with just the fact. And I'd like to tell you how the book got its name. A lot of people are worried that the name Dead Dog Road would be a turnoff because, we love dogs.
Right, right.
But I guess this is on my mind because someone sent me an email the other day and said, I want to read the book, but are the details about the dog abuse very graphic? And I said, well, it's not about a dog at all. There was a road north of town up in that area that some dog fighters used to dump their fighting dogs when they couldn't fight anymore. Horrible, I know. But it's a metaphor for the boy.
That's concerning that they were more worried about if they were going to read details about the animal abuse than the children. Really, honestly, I think some of them care more about animals than they do about...
Well, I have two examples of that. There were some kids in Kirbyville, Texas, who were being abused. Reports went in repeatedly. Someone reported that the pigs were not being taken care of. And the animal control went out and got the pigs. And as a result, the children were also removed. When I was trying so hard to find help for these kids, a friend of mine and I were talking about it. And she said, I know, she said, there's a news guy and he always does reports about animal abuse. Maybe he will care about this. And she said, it'd be easier to get help for a poodle, which, that we don't want animals abused either, but a precious child,
Yeah.
And maybe it's because it's easier to get help for them, that people feel like there's something they can actually do. With kids, we're so afraid of parents losing their rights, and children are human beings. They have no rights, and they should at least have the right to safety. I don't think that's asking too much here. Some of the same stories I do. If you took a dog and hung it up in a dark closet and shut the door and forgot about it, they would lock you up.
They sure would. You'd have a lynch mob outside your house.
Yes, you would. That is a case I read about. There was a little girl in Houston. She was a precious little 5-year-old girl, curly red hair. I'll never forget it. And CPS went out to do an investigation. The little girl had a sexually transmitted disease. The story CPS received was toilet seat. There again, that shows the lack of training. Well, she ended up dead. Action needs to be taken.
We can't sit back and assume someone else is going to do something because they're probably not. Even if it's your sister and she's abusing their child, you have to report it. Do you care if your niece or nephew survives? People don't understand how serious it is and how abuse escalates. I think that's a lot of the problem.
It is a huge issue in our society that does not receive the funding, the training, the attention it needs.
It's always after the fact is the problem.
Exactly. Well, I'm committed to getting my story out there. And I want to mention this to you. The town where this happened, I've had numerous people that I did not know from that area who have written me and just said thank you. And at the time, a lot of people didn't understand why I was fighting against the system.
You were really the one there advocating for these abused children, and people were just assuming you were the bad guy because the police said so.
Exactly. Someone sent me a message on Facebook the other day, and she said, I was Svetlana's first grade teacher. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's great that she remembers her from back then.
Everybody remembers these children. The bus driver tried to help. A lot of people honestly tried to help, but it was just the people who had power, and they were intimidated by them as well.
Yeah, sure.
And they saw what happened to me. People were being threatened with arrest if they hit Alexey and things like that. I was put in a position to either do what I could or try to pretend that I didn't know it was happening, which, because of the children's home and because of being in a position of talking to the children and hearing Alexey's story, I don't know how I could have lived with myself if I had done that.
Yeah, and that's because you're one of the ones with the empathy, which it seems like a lot of people involved just didn't have it.
That is true. And, as a therapist, one of the things that you really have to have, this is all therapists, all counselors, empathy it's an ingredient that you have to have when you enter into a therapeutic relationship. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the person you're working with.
Can't imagine it would be a good thing if you went into that career without empathy. It would be, hello, Dr. Lecter. It's not something you want someone to be involved in if they don't have that.
True.
Yeah.
And I want to say this too. A lot of social workers are wonderful people.
Yes.
And they're doing their best and they're doing everything they can to help. But the hierarchy, there were some CPS workers who quit over this case.
That's heartening, at least. It's not everyone. It's just the ones who had the power. That's a problem.
Right. And well, in this case, in this situation, the way they have it set up is the people making the decisions never encounter the children.
Right. If they had, I wonder if that would have changed something. Just look into those eyes and tell that child, no, you're not coming out of that house.
I would like to think so. I think that's definitely one of the things that needs to change along with the notice.
Yeah, they should be doing just drop-ins.
There was a woman who worked for juvenile detention because occasionally Alexey was sent to juvenile detention for the crime of, running away. He was always so glad when that happened.
Oh, sure. It's a nicer environment than he was in.
Oh, yeah. It was really good. So, that's sad in itself. But he was protected. He could take a shower. He had food to eat. It was the briar patch. But anyway, there was someone there, and they tried to help him. And she went to the home without announcing, and she pushed her way in. She was a gutsy thing. She was kind of young, and she was like, don't stand in my way. But she saw the room. She saw the mattress on the floor, the baby bed mattress that she sometimes drug out, so he had to sleep on the floor just because that was just who we're dealing with here. She saw the bucket, and she went to a judge, and
thank goodness she did that. They suffered for so long.
Yes, they did. And every time he ran away, I was afraid he was going to end up dead.
It's such a good book. It really, really is. And I'm not just saying that. It was so engrossing. I could not stop reading it.
I've heard that from several people. The editorial reviews have been good. I can't brag about it because it's not that kind of story. I did my best.
You told it very well, and I think everyone should read it. I mean, if they're listening to this podcast, this is the book that you want to read. It is so important. It really does tell an important story.
Thank you so much for that. It's been a heck of a journey.
Now, time for one last sponsor break. Thanks to Diane for talking with me about her book. Again, please check out Dead Dog Road, A True Story into the Dark World of an Abused Child by Diane Black, which you can buy on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. And finally, it's time for shout-outs to my newest patrons. Andriana S. from Burleston, Texas, Angie S. from Brodhead, Kentucky, Christina R. from Linwood, Washington, Sandra C. from County Leash, Ireland, and from Pleasantville, thank you to Kaylee with a K. I truly appreciate all of my patrons for your support, without which I couldn't continue making this podcast. Thank you all. To make a monthly or annual pledge, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. That's it for this episode. Join me next time for another child's story. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something. I'm going to share something I normally wouldn't. One of my patrons shared their own story of childhood abuse and asked me to share it anonymously. This is the story of the abuse my father put me through. A normal parent, a sane parent, would prioritize studying and sleeping on the weekend, not sport. It's not rocket science. The less time children have to study, the less work they'll do, and the less information they will remember. And if they dislike sport or any activity chosen by the parents instead of the child, they will consider it work. It's very simple. I never enjoyed sport, therefore I was being tortured. I was never paid to do sport, therefore I was a slave. It's not difficult to study on the football field. It's impossible to study on the football field. It would make more sense to ask your children to conduct an inventory on your fridge than yell at them because they didn't do their homework. My father was upset because I played video games all the time. Video games were the only way I could de-stress in the few hours of free time I had. Even during the holidays, my father would send me to tennis camp 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. I was constantly miserable. It felt like he was punishing me for no reason. Instead of practicing sport all the time, I would have much rather worked in a sweatshop for free. At least that way, I would be contributing something of value to society. There's no justification for denying children a proper education. Because I knew I wouldn't remember my lessons or have the time needed to develop any skills, my grades plummeted and I quickly became suicidal. In senior high, I would page my math teacher almost every day during lunch. I needed help with math, obviously, but more importantly, I needed someone to talk to, and I certainly couldn't speak with my owner. In 11th grade, I didn't even know that WRT meant with respect to when it came to math. Although these interactions took less than 10 minutes every day, they were absolutely essential when it came to maintaining my sanity. I needed someone to talk to, regardless of the reason or the topic. My father's abuse continued even after I barely graduated from high school. In college, I was still forced to practice sport every single weekend. Obviously, my grades continued to decline. Ironically, video games not only kept me sane and prevented my suicide, but they also improved my grades. I wasn't addicted to video games per se. I was addicted to reading and problem solving. Video games had copious amounts of both. Video games also required a sharp memory, since to complete adventure games and enjoy the ending, tasks often had to be done in a very specific order. What was the worst thing my father did? When I was 13, he decided to send me to a special school for 6 months. No, not a special school for students with learning disabilities. It was a hybrid school summer camp system. The only problem was that it ran for 6 months, and it combined weekly runs and a hike every single weekend. I don't want to name names, so I'll just call it the 66th Circle of Hell. My abusive father sent me there for one weekend before the official start to test the waters. After that, he asked me for my opinion. I said I hated it, and it took him less than half a second to say, "No, I want you to go," and deny me a decent education. Why did he send me to the 66th circle of hell? Because Prince Charles went there. What he forgot to take into account is how Prince Charles was royalty and probably never studied. If I was a prince, I'd go out partying every single night. Charles was also 17 when he attended, not 13. The schedule was very simple, so it wasn't difficult for the teachers to organize and manage. It was, however, extremely difficult for the students to endure. Every day we woke up at 7 a.m., breakfast at 7:30, first class at 8:05. School was typical: math, English, geography, biology, and it finished at 3 p.m. Then we'd spend 2 hours being lectured about the vast benefits of the whole experience. This would often include mandatory exercise and a run every Wednesday. This built up toward a 10-kilometer run on the final day at the end of the year. Unfortunately, not everyone is genetically built for long distance. This also made us too exhausted, not to mention miserable, to study efficiently at night. We had 2 hours for homework every weekday. This was barely enough to finish the algebra problems they assigned us, let alone everything else. An entertainment night was held on Wednesdays. This meant we had even less time to study. It's like they were deliberately trying to create a generation of uneducated bumpkins who couldn't do anything except sweep floors and flip burgers. No one studied on the weekends. No one had time to study on the weekends. Every weekend was spent hiking, and since none of that would be on the final exam, it was all ultimately harmful. It wasn't a school, it was worse than a prison. Prisoners have free time, and prisoners are allowed to read and study to their heart's content. As I mentioned, we had a hike every weekend. Rowing, marching, you name it. Everything physical, nothing mental or academic. So no, you couldn't catch up on your studies on the weekends. On the Sunday morning of the rowing hike, we did a capsizing drill. The teachers flipped us into freezing cold water, barely 5 degrees Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. A look at the official school guidebook clearly said it was an optional capsizing drill, but the teachers didn't care. They wanted us to suffer through hypothermia. Since I did not want to be there to begin with, it wasn't long before I attempted suicide. They took us to a seaside cliff for one of the hikes. I almost jumped off, but some students pulled me back. When we returned to the campus, it was obvious that they cared more about preserving their image than about the welfare of their students. The headmaster spoke with me for about 20 minutes and never even bothered to inform my parents. No one else spoke of it again. Looking back on it now, I'm surprised I didn't succeed in taking my own life.
Thank you to my anonymous patron for bravely sharing their story. For every child's story I tell, I can't even begin to imagine how many people out there have similar stories. My heart goes out to every single one of you.